It's been a long day, I'm sure, and we're pleased to have you all here at this final session. And it's well worth your time to come in for this last session. We have a fantastic speaker for the final session, Anthony Leiserowitz, who is the director of the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication and is in the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's a recognized expert on public opinion and risk perception, and that's one of the key elements of this problem is just how do people perceive this problem? Why isn't there more public support for it, or is there? If there is public support, how can we turn it into action that actually solves the problem? And so this is a fascinating field, and you're going to get a great talk from Anthony. So with that, please welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, everyone. Is this on? It is. Great. I'm going to get myself some water. Can you hear me? Check 1, 2, 3. Great. Wonderful. So first of all, let me just say thank you. Thank you to Tom Malone and everyone here at Climate CoLab, not just for inviting me and organizing this event, but for doing this. This is such a great initiative. Harnessing the power of people all across the country and around the world towards climate solutions is exactly the kind of initiatives we need. It's a 21st century approach to solving these kinds of problems. So Tom, kudos to you for doing this. Yeah, absolutely. So let's see, my slide is not up. I don't believe that's just me. There we go. Okay, so let me quickly introduce myself. So I direct the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. What we do is we study how publics respond to the issue of climate change. What do they understand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and the severity of different kinds of impacts. What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in, willing to change? What are the barriers that prevent them from changing behavior? And when I say behavior, we really look at 4 main categories. We look at how people use and conserve energy at home and on the road. We look at consumer behavior. To what extent will people prefer products and services that will lower their own carbon footprint? But also, very interestingly, to what extent are they willing to reward or punish companies for their actions? So you could think of this as boycotts or boycotts. We also look at social behavior. How do we talk about this issue? What are the underlying social norms, these unwritten cultural rules that guide so much of our daily lives? And then last but not least, we look at political behavior. To what extent are Americans or others around the world willing to get engaged as active citizens to demand the systemic change, the political change that we all know is going to be part of this solution? And then, of course, we're scientists, so our ultimate question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get very engaged with this issue, others are apathetic, and some are downright hostile or dismissive? Last thing to say is that we work at many different scales. So I'm going to mostly talk about, here I'll talk a bit about our work at the global scale. So we've been working for a number of years with the Gallup World Poll. In fact, let me just go to this. So we've been doing lots of national studies here in the United States. We do 2 every year. In fact, we just came out of the field with our latest national survey literally 2 days ago, and I'll share with you just a couple results we haven't made public yet. We've been doing a lot of international studies. We conducted the first ever national study in China. Also the first ever study in India, and I'm happy to talk about those. We partnered with the Gallup World Poll for a number of years, looking at how this issue plays in about 130 countries around the world, and I'll show just a tidbit of that. But we've also been working increasingly at the state and local levels as well. So states, cities, and so on. But the other main thing that we do is outreach. So we're actually trying to leverage some of the research insights that we have. And 2 of our main projects is something we started just a couple months ago called Climate Connections. It's a daily national radio program, 90 seconds long, so short, that's now on in about 60 markets across the country, where we basically are trying to help listeners connect the dots between this abstract global problem and our own daily lives in the here and now. profiling the people who are observing the changes, feeling and experiencing the impacts, but most importantly, are contributing to the solutions all around us. Because most of us don't know those stories. And then a major project we've been doing for years is trying to engage the nation's weathercasters or broadcast meteorologists as climate change communicators. Great project. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A if people are interested. OK, so I should also say that we couldn't do this work without all of our dear friends and partners, notably, in particular, our friends at George Mason University at the Center for Climate Change Communication, but other researchers across the country, and of course, our sponsors. Literally, we couldn't do this work without them. OK, so let me begin here with a proposition. Let me just suggest that it would be great, it would be wonderful if everyone in the United States, and frankly around the world, could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. A full semester course dedicated to understanding the science behind climate change, the causes, the consequences, the solutions. A full, long, 3-month-long course dedicated to really understanding this. But it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't, in fact, millions of people who want that information. There are, who are actively asking questions and looking to the scientific community to help answer the questions that they have about climate change. And as a community, we need to do all we can to go more than halfway to meet them and answer those questions. But that's not most people. Most people are way too busy with their daily lives. They don't have the background, they don't have the interest, they don't have the training. Okay? So the question I'd like to propose is, let's just assume that there's enough space in most people's heads, enough shelf space, for 5 key facts. Okay? What would you want them to understand about climate change that will help inform their decisions today and for decades to come? Do they need to know, for instance, exactly how many parts per million of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere? Do they need to know exactly how the carbon cycle works? Okay. Do they need to know what thermohaline circulation is and exactly how that works? Okay? So we would suggest, based on our work thus far, that we can actually boil this down to just 5 key facts. Okay? There are plenty more that you need to know, but there are at least 5 that we would hope everyone could at least understand. And here they are in just 10 words. Okay? In fact, a friend of mine has converted this to a haiku, but I won't give you that one. OK, it's pretty simple. And for all the complexity of climate change, and it is a complex scientific issue, but it really does, for most people, boil down to a couple key facts. It's real. It's happening. Secondly, it's us. To expand on that a little bit, yes, of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years in the past, but this time it's different. This time it's due primarily to human activities. Third, it's bad. It's bad now, and it's going to get much worse in the future if we continue on this current path. Fourth, the experts agree about all of these points. There's still plenty of uncertainties in science. There's still plenty of debate over exactly what the impacts will be felt where and when, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, et cetera. But about the basics, there is no argument. And yet, as scientists, we have not actually been very good at communicating what we actually almost entirely all agree about, which is that it's real, it's us, and it's bad. I'll come back to this. But fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we need to communicate that there's hope. That, in fact, this is not an unsolvable problem. There are legions of things that we can do to reduce this issue, as well as prepare for the now inevitable impacts. OK. So with that, let me say a little bit about the global context. Now, this, again, is data that I'm pulling from our work with the Gallup World Poll, done in about 130 countries around the world. And this is a few years old, so things have probably changed a little bit, but I don't think it's changed that much. But it really helps set this into this larger frame, because, of course, we get very fixated on the US and its own politics, and I'll get to that. But this is the bigger picture. So here is a map of the world that basically is mapping those people who are unaware of climate change, who've never heard of it, which turns out to be 4 out of 10 adults on the planet. That's almost 2 billion people have never heard of climate change. And what you see is that there's a very sharp north-south distinction here, where it's the countries like Canada, the United States, Europe, Australia, Japan, where there's very high awareness. Almost all Americans at least have heard of global warming before. And you get much less awareness, of course, in countries like this. In India, where we've done that study, found that about 2/3 of Indians have never heard of climate change. Okay? Bangladesh, about 70% of Bangladeshis. It's a poster child for climate change in international discussions, but about 70% of Bangladeshis have never heard of it. Now, however, that doesn't mean they haven't been experiencing and observing the impacts in their own local environments. They have. In fact, that's what they tell us over and over again. And the other really interesting thing about this is that when you give them just a small description of what climate change is, like a sentence, they immediately say, yes, that's happening. Okay? And I'm really worried about it. And I want action about it. When we did that in India, we found immediately over 70% of Indians said, yes, this is serious. Okay? So it doesn't take a lot. But there's still this fundamental gap in awareness, which is important. Because if you've never heard of climate change, you're more vulnerable. Because you can't be understanding, let alone taking actions to deal with the impacts you're already feeling, much less the decisions and actions you're going to be taking for decades to come. These countries are making huge investments right now. Where do we build our schools? Where do we build our hospitals? Where do we put our roads? Where do we build cities for millions of people? If you're not thinking about climate change, you're probably doing things in ways that are going to put people in harm's way. The other thing that we really see that popped out in this work is risk perception. So how serious of a threat is global warming to you and your family? We still see that big north-south split, but now it's quite different. Of those people who've heard of global warming, you find that people in the US and Canada and in the northern countries tend to say, it's not going to hurt me. It's not going to hurt my family. But for people down here who know how vulnerable they are, because many of them are living in very marginal circumstances to begin with, they understand that this is something that's quite threatening. Okay, so to quickly summarize, because we've just covered all the diversity of the United States of the world in about 5 minutes. But overall, we know that there's a roughly 2 billion people, adults, who've never heard of climate change. Okay? We, of course, are going to need lots of different strategies that are culturally and nationally specific to engage people. Every country's different. Every people are different. And you need to meet people where they are, and I'm going to come back to that. But very crudely, priority 1 is awareness building in the developing world, but increasing risk perceptions and hope in the developed world. I'll come back to that with the US example. So let me now turn to the bulk of our work, which has been here in the US. Okay, so again, remember there are these 5 big ideas. How are we doing here in the US? Okay, so what I'm going to show you now are results from nationally representative surveys that we've been doing over the past, oh gosh, now I can't remember, 8 years? 7, 8 years? And this is going to include data that we just literally pulled from the field a couple days ago. So a majority of Americans do think that global warming is happening, 64% as of just a few days ago. And that's gone through its ups and downs, but in particular, I want you to notice this major decline that happened back in 2008 to 2010. Okay? And this is a pattern you're going to see again and again. It's actually what not just we, but everyone else found that's been tracking public opinion on these issues over time. So Gallup, Pew, and others. On average, we all found that there was a 14 percentage point drop in public acceptance that climate change is real from 2008 to 2010. Since then, it's been working its way slowly back up and down and up, but not back to where we were. This is kind of a high water mark. Because basically you had 2004, 5, 6, and 7 was really the high water mark. So you had things like Schwarzenegger's work out in California, kind of thumbing his nose at the Bush administration. You had the fourth IPCC report, which was the first to say it is unequivocal that humans are causing climate change. You had the Nobel Prize for the IPCC and Al Gore. You had Inconvenient Truth. You had lots of stuff. It was in the air. It was in the water. People were talking about climate change across the US. But then it all came down pretty dramatically in 2008. Only about half of Americans think that if it's happening, it's mostly human-caused. So we've clearly got a lot of work to do here in the United States. Again, there was a substantial drop back here, and it's been burbling pretty consistently right around 50% ever since. Very importantly, only 1 in 10 Americans understands that it's over 90% of climate scientists who believe that global warming is happening and human-caused. Okay? The correct answer, as best we can tell, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 97% of climate scientists. The people who do this for a living, publish in the peer-reviewed literature, are in agreement, based upon the evidence, that climate change is human-caused and happening. And yet only 1 in 10 Americans understands that. Okay? Now this is really consequential because in our other work we've identified this as what we call a gateway belief. The more people understand that the experts have reached this kind of agreement, the more they themselves say, well then I think it's real, and I think it's human-caused, and I think it's a serious problem, and in turn, they're more likely to support policy, and they're more likely to take individual action. Because it makes perfect sense from a layperson's perspective. If your perception is that the experts are still arguing over whether the problem even exists, then for lots of people, they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to just take a wait-and-see attitude. Scientists, go off in a room somewhere, you're going to figure it out, and when you do, you'll tell me, right? And then I'll take it seriously. Of course, what they don't know is that, of course, scientists did that decades ago. This is not an accident, okay? This has been partly, in large part, the product of a very active, well-financed, and very effective disinformation campaign, okay? That came literally chapter and verse out of the strategy of the tobacco wars, okay? This is exactly what the tobacco companies did back in the late 50s and 60s when the Surgeon General was saying that smoking is bad for your health. They said, let's continue to support scientists, let's push the line that they're still figuring out, is smoking bad for you or not? Knowing that if people still believed there was still discussion about that fundamental scientific fact, people would keep smoking. And they raked in billions of dollars with that approach for years, for decades. It's only been recently that this society has had this whole-scale cultural shift where smoking is no longer glamorous in the way it was when I grew up, okay? The exact same strategy, including some of the exact same scientists who were saying that smoking is not bad for you, are the same scientists who are saying climate change isn't real, or it's not human-caused, or it's not a serious problem, okay? It's been a very effective strategy. And one of the outcomes of that is the fact that most Americans are not very worried about it. As of just a couple days ago, it was 11%. 1 out of 10 Americans say they're very worried about this issue. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the ones that we've seen very consistently over the years is that many Americans think of climate change as distant. Okay? Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe small island countries. Not the United States, not my state, not my city, not my friends and family, or any of the people and places that I care about. So it seems like one of those issues that's out there, okay? Even if people accept that it's real, many of them feel like, you know what, we can stick this one on the back burner. We'll get to it later. We got more pressing issues now. Not realizing, of course, that the pot's boiling over on the back burner. Okay, and that therefore means that many Americans just don't prioritize it, and that's exactly what we see in these. You've all seen this before. We see this in our own data as well. This comes from the Pew Research Center, and that is that global warming shows up very consistently at the bottom of national priorities. And note that this is the percentage change, point change since 2007, and it's dropped 9 points since that high water mark I was mentioning before. So did the environment, so did energy. What really rose? The economy, jobs in particular. Okay, so we'll get to this some more. All right, so what's going on here? Why were those big declines from starting in 2008? Well, it's complex, and we actually have a paper under review right now where we try to disentangle this. But it's important to recognize that there were a lot of things happening in this critical time period. First, the economy, the economy, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble popped. It's when the financial crisis hit. Unemployment surges up over 10%. And quite understandably, quite rightly, people get very, very worried about losing their job, losing their home, seeing foreclosure signs down the block, that the whole financial system was about to collapse. So it's not at all surprising that the economy and jobs soared to the top of people's priorities, where they've dwarfed all other issues ever since. But what's less understood is what happened with media coverage. Media coverage dropped dramatically. It dropped, my colleague Max Boykoff tracks newspaper coverage. It dropped by 2/3 in this time period. And Bob Brule at Drexel University tracks nightly network news coverage, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, et cetera. It dropped 90%. Okay? And it's not like it was getting a whole lot of attention back in 2007. Okay? We've actually done analyses of the news hole. You can actually add up and look at all the news coverage, all the articles in magazines and newspapers, on television, on cable, on radio, and you'd say, this is everything the mainstream press covered. What proportion of that was climate change in the good old days of 2007? 0.88%. So less than 1% of total coverage back in the good old days was climate change related. And by 2011, it had dropped to 0.1%. Okay? Now this is important because most people only know about climate change because of the media. Okay? If this auditorium had windows, and unfortunately it doesn't, we could all look outside right this very moment, and there's CO2 pouring out of tailpipes, it's pouring out of smokestacks, it's pouring out of buildings. In fact, there's CO2 coming out of your mouth and nose this very second. But until I said it, you weren't conscious of it, because it's invisible. You see that? No, of course not. Okay? So we can't even see the fundamental cause of this issue. And by the way, human breathing is not an important contributor to climate change. Let me just make that straight. So we can't even see the fundamental cause of this problem. Okay? And that's actually a design challenge that I'd like to pose to this entire conference. Please, somebody, find me an additive that we can put in a gas tank and you can see CO2. I guarantee you we change this issue overnight. Because if we were to go outside right this very second, and if it wasn't raining, we could look up, and there is a giant cloud, billowing cloud, almost volcano-like, I assume, pouring out of Boston up into the sky. Think about that. You walk around in it every day, and yet you're not conscious of it. And there's another one pouring out of New York, and another one pouring out of Las Vegas, and Los Angeles, and Beijing, and Paris, and Johannesburg, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when the media doesn't cover this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind for most Americans. They don't know scientists. They just don't. Only 1 in 200 Americans say they even know a scientist. In fact, there was a survey recently that asked, could they name a living scientist? And most couldn't, and the most often cited name were people like Einstein, okay? If only he was still alive. So it's not they're not reading the peer-reviewed journals, they're not reading the IPCC reports. Only 14% of Americans say they've even heard of the IPCC. Yeah. We live in this little green bubble where IPCC, of course you know what that is. No. Most people have no idea what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is. They've never heard of it. Okay? So that's what we're trying to deal with. There were some unusual cold weather events, snowmageddon and snowpocalypse. We're running out of terms. I already talked about this. ClimateGate happens in this time period. This bogus stealing of emails that were interpreted as if somehow scientists were making up all the data. There have been, of course, 6 independent investigations of it, all of which find there was absolutely no problem at all. But perhaps most importantly is increasing political polarization. This issue has gotten intensely partisan. And it really starts in 1997. 97, Democrats and Republicans weren't that far apart. But 97 is when Bill Clinton and Al Gore signed the Kyoto Protocol, and we're thinking about sending it to the Senate for ratification. And ever since that moment, the two parties have gotten farther and farther and farther and farther and farther apart until we are where we are today. Okay? And as of just a couple days ago, we're looking at a very different world come January. Jim Inhofe, senator from Oklahoma, who's written a book in which he says climate change is a hoax, is going to be the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Ted Cruz is likely to be the chairman of the Science Committee. Okay? So it's a different world. Okay, but there's also been that rebound. So what's going on there? Well, again, it's complicated, but at least we know a few things are happening. The economy and unemployment are improving. There has been more media coverage in recent years, and in part that's because the nation had experienced several years of extreme weather disasters, all-time record-setting events. Now, this is complicated. It's not like people suddenly just experience a hurricane or a flood or a drought and they go, okay, now I get it, okay? No, people are complicated, and especially when they have deeply held values, strong ideologies, human beings, all of us, are prone to what's called motivated reasoning. We look for evidence that reinforces what we believe, we ignore or discount evidence that seems to contradict what we believe, and we'll even distort evidence to make it seem to fit like it's fitting our narrative, okay? So people who are strongly committed, the people who already are firmly convinced climate change is real, when they experience a flood or a drought, their tendency is to go, aha, global warming. And sometimes that's appropriate scientifically, sometimes it's not. On the other end of the spectrum, those people who don't believe climate change is real at all or that it's a hoax are highly predisposed to say, aha, polar vortex, it was really cold. There's your proof that global warming is not happening. Okay? But in between those extremes are most of the rest of us. And most other people, again, who don't really know the science, will draw upon their own recent experience to decide whether global warming is happening or not, or serious or not. And they are, in fact, infected by these things. So we see, as of last spring, 57% of Americans now say that global warming is affecting weather in the United States now. And moreover, are even willing, about half, to say that it's been impacting specific events. The fact that 2012 at the time was the warmest year on record, the drought, the terrible drought that was going on in the Great Plains back then, Superstorm Sandy, even the big snowstorm that hit New England, if you'll remember, a couple years ago. So what these events do is that we see them as teachable moments. They're one of the few times that Americans are actually thinking about an issue and a news story that has a direct connection to climate change. And people see the pattern of these extreme events. Okay? It's not even the one event that one experiences or sees on television. It's the pattern. There's an old, great phrase. If something happens once, it's happenstance. If it happens twice, it's a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, you're beginning to see a pattern. And if it happens 4, 5, 7, 12, 15, 22, 24 times, then people start scratching their heads and say, well, geez, what's going on with the weather? Could that have something to do with global warming? Okay. So it's at least the opening of having a conversation. Okay, the other really important thing that I just want to talk quickly about is that we very quickly realized in our work that, of course, Americans don't speak with a single voice on this issue. And one of the first rules of effective communication, frankly, is one of the first rules of effective education, as well as getting married and having a successful life, is know your audience. Who are they? What do they come to this exchange with? What ideas do they already have in their minds? What emotions does this issue trigger in them? What are the values that they have? Who do they trust as a messenger? Where do they get their news and information? What do their friendship networks have to say about it? Okay? All of those are really important factors in shaping how people interpret and respond to this issue. And in our work, we've identified what we call global warming 6 Americas, that you can actually take the American public and see 6 very different kinds of audiences within them. And so here's what we had as far as late as a year ago. We'll update these very soon. But back then, we had about 16% of Americans who are what we call the alarmed. These are people who are convinced it's real, that it's human-caused, that it's serious and, in fact, an urgent problem. They strongly support policy action to deal with it. But their main question is, what can we do? What can I do? And what can we do? And it's actually an indictment of our community, that we've done a far better job communicating the problem than we have the solutions. Okay? And we're even beginning to hear a little bit sneaking in there, it's still small, but it's a rising question saying, is it too late? Are we done? Is it over? That's a really dangerous belief. It's a really dangerous belief. To quote Henry Ford, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. All right, the concerned, about 27%. These are people who think it's happening. They do think it's human-caused. They do even think it's serious. But they tend to think of it, again, as distant in time and space. So they tend to say, well, all right, it's important, but it's not of high priority. We'll focus more on this later. Then the cautious, very much on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious, or is it kind of overblown? They're kind of paying attention, but haven't really made up their minds yet. Then a small group we call the disengaged, and these are the people, much like the people I was talking about around the rest of the world. They've heard of global warming in this case, but they don't know anything about it. They don't know what the causes are. They don't know what the consequences are. They don't know what the solutions are. They're pretty checked out. So basic awareness is the main barrier facing them. Then a group we call the doubtful, and these are people who generally don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural. Nothing humans have anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about, so I don't think about it very much, and I'm kind of suspicious about it, but I don't see it as much of a risk. And then last but not least, those that we call the dismissive, who are firmly convinced it's not happening, it's not human-caused, it's not a serious problem, and in fact, many are what we would lovingly call conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax. They say it's scientists making up data, that it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, that it's a scheme by Al Gore and his friends to get rich, and many, many other such narratives. We're actually doing a bunch of work on conspiracy theories these days, and it's fascinating, fascinating stuff. Okay, so note, however, that that's only 15%. That's only 15%. But there are a really loud 15%. There are really vocal 15%. There are 15% that's really well represented in the halls of Congress. And they've tended to both dominate the public square in terms of public discussion, and they've actually been able to successfully cow or intimidate many other people into being silent because people are afraid to even bring it up. Climate change has become one of these issues at the Thanksgiving Day table that you just don't talk about, right? It's like politics and religion and then climate change. Don't talk about it because you're going to get Uncle Harry all riled up, okay? But they're only 15%. And I've had this conversation with many, many institutions. I mean, from agencies to nonprofits to companies and so on, who want to talk about climate change, but they're afraid to because they're afraid of getting attacked by these folks. But they believe that those folks actually are 50% or more of the country. They're not. And by not talking about it, you're often doing a huge disservice to all of these other people who are actually looking for guidance. They're looking for someone to talk to them and say, what is this? Why should we care about this? Okay? And just to make that point, we've actually asked Americans several questions on this line, including this one. If you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? So this is a way of saying there are 3 completely different conversations happening in this country at the same time. Down here, the doubtful and dismissive, their main question is, so how do you know that global warming is happening or human-caused? And on a deeper level, why should I trust you? Whereas these groups in the middle are saying, okay, maybe it's real, but so what? Why should I care? What's it got to do with me? Or anything else I care about? Whereas the groups down here are like, okay, I'm with you. It's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but what do we do? What can we do? Okay, so I want to close with 6 proposed communication design challenges. These are big questions. I don't have the answers to them. I'm still trying to work through some of these myself. But one, how do we make the invisible visible? Again, how could we visualize CO2? Either by being able to see it directly coming out of tailpipes, or somehow having a camera that can detect CO2 and display it in a way that you can actually see it, or even symbolically. And there have been numerous attempts to try to display it symbolically, but it's not the same as being able to actually see it for yourself. Okay? But likewise, we're not very good at understanding the impacts. Okay? Far too many of us don't see the impacts. You've got to be trained to know where to look for most people, unless you happen to live in the Arctic, where it's pretty obvious. Low-lying areas around the world where it's getting to be increasingly obvious, and so on. So how do we get to see this? And likewise, the solutions, which for many people are invisible. They just don't know about them, even though they're happening all around us. How do we raise the awareness of the nearly 2 billion people who haven't heard of it yet? There have to be innovative ways to solve this, because it doesn't take a lot. How do we increase perceived risk and hope of the people here in the developed world? And this gets much more complicated because, again, it's a diverse audience. How do we increase public understanding of the scientific consensus? We find in our own work that when you convey that message, you can actually move people quite dramatically with just one description of the fact that there's this consensus. You can move people quite a bit. How do you do that at scale? How do we elevate climate change as a national priority? That's a tough one. Okay? It's never going to be as in your face for most of us on a daily routine basis as education and crime and even the economy. So how do we do that? And then most importantly, how do we build public and political will? How do we, in fact, shift the political climate of climate change? Okay? And let me use climate change itself as my analogy here. Just as when we warm the world's climate, we're making extreme events both more frequent and more intense, if we can shift the political climate of this issue, we make progress more frequent and to go much farther. Okay? How do we shift this conversation, especially in this country, which is so important in both for its own emissions, but also incredibly because of its role in the international politics of this issue? How do we begin to shift that conversation? That is a really big conversation and challenge for the next couple of years. So with that, thank you very much. You can always find our stuff right here.
Okay.
We have time for questions?
I hope so.
Okay.
Good, the mic's on. I'm Dave Finnegan. My program is Climate Change is Elementary, and I interpret English into English for elementary school students and their parents. And I worked for 10 years in Korea and Taiwan in the 1960s in family planning. We never mentioned in Korea or Taiwan that we have a population problem. Instead, we gave people incentives for having small family size that didn't require them to have a core belief that there was going to be a population problem. As a consequence, we reduced the average family size from 6 kids to 1.6 in a generation. Now, I think we could do the same thing, and we do that in our program with elementary school children. On the back of our business card, it says whether climate is changing or not, and whether people are responsible or not, these kids deserve a clean, green future. Let's give it to them. So the parents buy in whether they are doubters, deniers, or dismissive.
Sure.
And I think that we make a mistake by thinking that everybody has to have a core belief when really what they want is, what do I do? So we start with a list of things they can do. And I think after they've done a few of those things, they begin to believe. So that's, a question, but also a statement.
Yeah, well, and it's absolutely right. I think you've got to separate, though, out. I mean, this is, again, where it's complicated, because people, we got quite a lineup here, sorry. Let's see, it's complicated, because sometimes, you're right, people will change their behavior and develop an identity as someone who does these things that are friendly for the environment, and then become to change their belief, right? So sometimes it works just in opposite. Human beings are not rational, logical creatures all the time, okay? And there are definitely times when I think, when you're talking to a particular audience where it's deeply in their DNA at this point as a Republican or as a conservative, let's say, to say that climate change is a hoax, it's all a scheme by Al Gore, and as soon as you mention it, they think of Al Gore and they just loathe Al Gore, and so they can't get past that, then in sometimes of those cases, it's better to talk about all the other co-benefits, because there are enormous co-benefits for taking action towards a low-carbon society. Absolutely, in the short term, and in the medium term even, you can make great progress around a lot of those things. I would still argue, however, that for this issue, there is still always going to be this longer term need to get more people to understand the nature of this fundamental problem, okay? And that's not just for the mitigation reasons, some of which you can solve by just talking about clean energy and the benefits of energy efficiency and so on, but in particular when we start talking about adaptation. It's pretty hard to sell adaptation and major investments now in preparing ourselves for these impacts without talking about climate change. If you don't believe the sea levels are rising, it's pretty difficult to get people to spend $1 billion on protecting the coastline. So I would argue that there's always going to be a need, longer term need, to move people to that as well. But let me keep moving, so go ahead.
Hi, Anne-Marie Soulsby from Conservation Interaction.
Okay.
We're based in Tanzania, and we use media to communicate environmental solutions.
Yeah.
For this contest, our proposal was Collaborative Solutions Communication Platform.
Okay.
So I can actually help you with design question number 2.
Great.
So using radio, raising awareness of some of the 2 billion people that you're trying to reach globally.
Yeah.
If you could help us with some of the donors that also support you, that would be great.
So I've got a wallet right here, I think.
So it was interesting to see that you're using radio in the US with these climate connection stories.
Yeah.
I was interested to know why you chose radio when most people seem to be staring at their smartphone or their MacBook, and even in here. And also, how do you specifically measure your effectiveness and your success, especially with behavioral changes, as you report back to your donors? Because that's what I get asked all the time.
Sure. Okay, big questions. I'll just quickly say we chose radio because it was a huge missing niche. And it's also really cheap to play. I mean, for a few $100,000, we're able to do a national broadcast program that we're able to now get on a network nationwide for pretty cheap at very high quality, at least we believe it's pretty high quality, and we're reaching millions of people. So it's really a question of what can you do with limited resources. Now, if I could get, if I could own Fox and convert their broadcasting, I would go for that in a heartbeat. I can't do that. In terms of evaluation, well, we're only 2 months in. So what we're doing is a variety of things, and that's going to include experiments where we actually take some of our stories and test them in true scientific, rigorous fashion to see, can you move people's understanding and engagement with the issue for the targeted audiences that you're trying to go for. We've done national studies to establish baselines, and we're going to look for change over time in the markets in which we're operating. So I think there's a variety of tools now available in a way that just never were before to actually try to assess your impact. But in the end, it's going to be very difficult because we can't follow people around and see, did they in fact choose this product versus that product in the grocery store. We're not going to be able to do that. Okay. So you do the best you can.
Will the results be available to people as open source?
Great question. I don't know. Probably.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It won't be for a while, but thank you. OK, let's go back over here.
Yeah, quickly, just to speak to your first point about making carbon visible. On a smaller scale in Denmark, there's a incinerator, waste energy plant, whatever you want to call it, that is in planning stages, construction, and basically the idea behind it is that they're going to store up the smoke until it reaches the amount of 1 ton of CO2, then release it in a visible smoke ring, so 30 meters in diameter, 3 meters in height.
Wow.
And then in the evening, they'd light it up so people in Copenhagen could see, oh, there's another ton of CO2 that has been produced because of our waste.
Interesting.
So it's something that's perhaps applicable to American plants, certainly in other countries, and leave it to the Danes, obviously.
Will it actually be a smoke ring?
It will be a smoke ring.
Awesome.
Yeah. So yeah,
you got to hand it to the Danes
it's
for
stylish
design,
too, of
man.
course, right?
The Danes have design.
Yeah, you can check it out online. It sounds pretty cool. And there's a ski hill on the incinerator as well.
Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so yes.
Hi, Brad Johnson.
Hi, Brad.
Wanted to say I tweeted your 10 words. And it's been retweeted about a dozen times.
Oh, you can fit that into a tweet.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And you can even add a little thing before it. And one person even responded, it's like, thank you for saying you believe that there's hope. That made a difference to me. So there's good evidence that you're right on that.
Great.
My question is, and this may be a little small bore, but I'm kind of interested in what your study kind of has to say about this community, people because I think our own understanding our own inherent biases and preconceptions and beliefs, I think is really powerful to make us better, whether we're doing policy or advocacy.
Yeah.
So I think it's safe to assume that we're all in the alarmed category. So what have you seen demographically or
ideologically
about
So it's a great question, and I applaud you for being willing to take the hard look in the mirror, because that's what I think we all need to do. Look, there's a lot of things going on in there, one of which is something that we're calling the veil of knowledge, okay? And that is that when you come to learn something, and you know it as well as the people in this room know it, it's very difficult to forget it and remember that the person you're talking to has no idea what you're talking about, okay? That's really hard, and it's an endless source of needless frustration for most of us, because then we go, why don't you get it? Let me pound the past 20 years of my knowledge and experience and training into your head in 5 minutes. Why don't you believe me? Okay? So that is, I think, often a problem. Secondly, our values often get us into trouble too, because many, I'll certainly say within the environmental community, have tended in the past, they're getting more sophisticated now, but there's still plenty of it, to say, look, the reason why I came to care about this issue is because I care about birds, or I care about polar bears. And I don't mean to pick on polar bears, but they're a really good one to pick on because they become such an icon of this issue. And that engages some people. That's fantastic. Let me tell you about how horrible I feel about what we're doing to the polar bears, okay? But that only works with the other environmentalists who care about polar bears. And that's not most people. Most people are like, okay, what's a polar bear ever done for me? Okay? And some people get kind of angry and they say, look, a polar bear would eat me if it had the chance. Okay? So it's all about, back to the fundamental point of knowing your audience. What are the values that motivate them? And the trick for you is to figure out how can you change yourself and your own argument and your own approach in a way that you listen to them, really listen to them, and change the way you argue this case in a way that resonates with their values. Meet them where they are and try to lead them to where you are. Don't try to beat them over the heads with the science and the facts and your particular value system and insist that they change to be like you.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to stop.
All right. Thank you.
So thank you. That was really wonderful. I think a wonderful way to end the day. Unfortunately, someone else needs this room tonight, and we promised to be out. So we need to clear the stage right now. I think Tony will be around and can talk to you, and the reception is in the lobby right outside. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for a great day, and see you outside in the reception.